So I am often asked, what is Power Pivot? And how did you get that tab on your Excel ribbon? Well, in this video, we are going to look at what Power Pivot is and why would you use it. So what is Power Pivot? Well, Power Pivot is also known as the data model, and it is found in Excel and also in Power BI, enabling us to model our data ready for further analysis and reporting. Power BI offers much more in the way of connectors and DAX and certainly in visualizations, but in this video we're going to see how to use it in good old Excel, where we are also capable of amazing things. Now, Power Pivot enable us to work with large volumes of data. We are certainly not limited to the million rows of Excel or even to the hundreds of thousands where Excel begins to slow and struggle. We also get to use the powerful DAX language, a very rich formula engine enabling us to perform powerful calculations that we may not be able to do in Excel. And we can also work with multiple sources of data, multiple tables which we can relate. So classic Excel use of having data in different sheets or tables and using lookup formulas to bring them into one place, one table, where you can then do your sum ifs and create your pivot tables, etc. Power Pivot's not like that. We'll keep them separate and we will relate them so that we can then use those multiple tables in our pivot tables. So let's look at the scenario we're going to run through in this video. So we are going to bring in some data from a few different sources. On screen at the moment on the left, we have our transactions. We have 4 CSV files all saved into a folder, and we're going to bring all 4 in and append them to each other using Power Query. We then have these other tables. We have a list of courses, we have a list of venues, and we also have a calendar table. And the classic use of Excel would be to write a VLOOKUP or an index match going from the course column on the left to the table on the right and bringing in additional information. Now in this example, there's only one other column called category, but there could be loads of columns of information about the course. We also have the same situation with venue here. People would write a VLOOKUP to bring in information about the venue, bumping up the size of the transactions table on the left-hand side. It would get a lot wider as VLOOKUPs bring in extra columns, and that transactions table is the big table. Now in this video, it's only a little over 3,000 rows, I think, but this could easily be hundreds of thousands in Excel, really slowing it down. In Power Pivot, it could easily be more than 1 million, and it's nowhere near as much of a problem. And by creating relationships between the tables, instead of writing formulas like VLOOKUP, is a much more efficient way of working. We only have to mention the venue, such as Dover Court once, and information about it can be related rather than bringing that information in to be mentioned hundreds of thousands or millions of times. So this is going to be a simple model in this video just to get an understanding of what Power Pivot is and how it works. We're not going to create some amazing dashboard at the end, although we will be putting our data into a pivot table to do some basic analysis and show it working. We just want to focus on how Power Pivot helps us to work with these volumes of data and how we relate and write some basic DAX. Now, Power Pivot is a COM add-in, so you won't see the tab on the ribbon if you're new to using it. It needs to be enabled, and we can do that by clicking on the File tab, coming down to Options, into the Add-ins category on the left, then we'll select COM add-ins from this Manage list and click on Go. And here we have the checkbox to tick for the Power Pivot for Excel add-in. You tick that box, click OK. Mine's already enabled, so I'll click cancel, and you'll have that tab on the ribbon. Then you have two main ways that you can access Power Pivot. We can do that from that tab. So if I click on the tab on the ribbon, I'll see the opportunity to manage my data model, creating measures and adding data to the model, adding tables to the model. And these are things that we'll look at. Also, if I click on the data tab on that ribbon, there is a button to manage the data model in the data tools group there. And that will open up the Power Pivot window where you can also create measures, relate your tables, bring data in from different sources and work with Power Pivot. Now let's begin to import our data from those different sources into Power Pivot. Now, one way we can do that is I could go to the Data tab and open up the data model. I can open up this Power Pivot window. And from within Power Pivot, we have options on the Home tab here to import data from different databases, from services, and then from other sources where you'll get options for Excel files and from the web and various other feeds, etc. But that can be quite limited, and you're heavily encouraged to use Power Query to import this data into the model and not to do it through Power Pivot, although it is possible. So if I close down this Power Pivot window and sticking with the Data tab, I'm going to get data from file and from folder. So we will begin by importing those 4 CSV files with our transactional data. This will ask us for the path. If I click on Browse, and I'll navigate to what I want, which is Power Pivot Intro, and then the Data folder. And I'll click OK, and this will take us to this window where it lists all the files from that folder with some information about it, such as extensions and the date they were last accessed and modified. Towards the bottom we have a few buttons, and I'm clicking Transform Data to take us into the Power Query editor where we could perform multiple transformations to shape what we want. Now, I've done various videos on Power Query on this YouTube channel, so we're not going to get too involved with that here. All I'm going to do is click the button to combine these files in header of content there. This is their opportunity to check through the files. I'm just going to click OK. And that's going to stack them up into one big transactional list. All 4 CSVs combined into one table. I'm going to remove this first column because I do not need any of the information stored there. I'm going to check the name of this query on the right and just capitalize that D, but I'll keep it called data. And as easy as that, no other work here. I'm going to close and load to, and this is going to be a connection only, and I'm adding it to the data model. So I mentioned earlier that this is, I believe, a little over 3,000 rows of data, so not really anything troublesome. But imagining that this is hundreds of thousands or millions of rows of data, we do not need to put this into an Excel workbook. It is stored in the model, meaning we do not have the limitations that Excel produces. If I click OK, that query is loaded on the right-hand side here in the Queries and Connections pane, and it is 3,214 rows. I'm going to collapse some of these ugly looking queries that were created, so I just see my data one, and let's go and get the other tables that we need. It's back to get data, back to from file, but this time they're all in an Excel workbook. I have 3 tables all in that same workbook. I'm going to navigate to my desktop where it is for now, Power Pivot Intro folder, and there is the courses file that I want. Import, the navigator window appears, and I can see 2 worksheets, 3 tables. One of the tables was called Courses, but has been branded Courses 1 because there's a sheet called Courses as well. I'm going to tick, select multiple items, and choose the 3 tables. Previews on the right hand side, but let's skip along. Transform data, so I could make modifications. But in this video, I'm not going to be doing too much there. In fact, I think the only thing I am doing as I look at the calendar table, which is something we'll be using a little bit of, is come to the courses query on the left, this courses table, and I'm going to rename it courses and not courses 1. I'll check the data types in the headers, and I'll click on venues and check that, but I kind of know it's all right. And I'm just going to close and load to, connection only, data model, click OK. So that loads on the right hand side there, and I have the transactional table, a fact table, and then 3 lookup tables, one for the dates, one for courses, one for venues, all loaded into the model so that we can now start to look at modeling that data. So at the moment, we have these 4 different queries or data sources loaded into the model. And if I was to click on the Insert tab and create a pivot table, and it automatically picks up that I'll want to be using the workbook's data model. So I'll do that and I'll just insert it to this worksheet. And on the right hand side, we have the field list appear, and you can see the 4 different tables with arrows next to them to expand them, and that they're coming from this model. So it looks a little bit different to what you might be used to if you're new to Power Pivot, but you've used pivot tables before. Now let's see an example for what we're dealing with right now. If I expand the courses table here, and I'll bring some course information in, like the course name, and I'll put that in rows, and that quite happily lists the different courses from that table. And then maybe the open data, the transactional table, and I'm just going to drag in the attendees. And we get this. So that's going to sum the attendees from that transactional table. Something I'm sure we're interested in doing. How many attendees attended each of the different courses throughout all of this data, these 4 years worth of data. And we can see a couple of things here. First of all, in the pivot table, they've all got the exact number of attendees. And the grand total is ridiculous. It shows the same number as well. So there's obviously a problem there. Also, in the field list on the right, I have a warning that I've got no relationships between those tables and that I probably need some. And this is what, outside of Power Pivot, you'd typically be doing with a VLOOKUP, bringing that information together into one place to be used. Here, we need those relationships. So let's go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to click on the Power Pivot tab, and I'm going to click on this Manage button at the start, which is the exact same button that you see on the Data tab and we used earlier in this video. Here we have the Power Pivot window, and I can see there are 4 sheet tabs at the bottom of the screen. So it looks very much like Excel, but it certainly is not Excel. We do not click in the cells that you can see here, although it does look like a worksheet. This is called your data view. We also have a diagram view. If I click on the diagram view at the top, then we get this. We see the 4 different queries or tables that we're dealing with here, and there are no relationships between them at the moment. Now, before I create those relationships, I just want to switch back to data view, and at the bottom I'm going to navigate to the calendar sheet, because there's a couple of things that I'd like to do on here. And to explain this better, just before I make some of these changes, I'm going to click on this little Excel icon in the top left of the window to bring me back to the workbook. And what I'm going to do is, with this pivot table, I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm going to remove the course and the number of attendees. And instead, I want to bring in data from the calendar table. I'm going to bring in the weekday name. And as I put weekday name in rows, look at how it orders it. It's ordered it alphabetically and not by the week. So Friday 1st, Monday 2nd. And if I remove weekday name and put in the month name, we have the same issue. It's alphabetical and not in the sequence that months would be in a year. So this is a problem that you get with Power BI and also with Power Pivot, but you do not get with Excel. Excel have a custom list, so it knows how to order them. Power Pivot doesn't. So what we're going to do is come back into Power Pivot. I'll start with the month name. I'm going to select the month name column. And then on the Home tab, a button Sort by Column. Sort by Column. What column do you want to sort? Is it month name? Yes. What by? The month number. Click OK. That will now know how to order them. It's going to use the number of the month, 1, 2, 3, etc., to know how to order the name. January, February, March, etc. And then we'll do the same thing to weekday name. I'll select weekday name, sort by column, sort by column. Automatically picks up weekday name because it's selected. By the weekday column, click OK. That is done. I could explore that if I wanted by switching back to the workbook. And if I drag in month name again, this time it's ordered correctly. Remove that, drag in weekday name, it's ordered correctly. Let's go back to the model. Because the next thing I'd like to do here is on the Design tab at the top, we're going to mark this as a date table. So when we're performing some time intelligence in our DAX and our analytics, it knows that this is the column of dates. To perform time intelligence, you should have a query, a table, which lists all the dates from all of the years from your data. This is important. This is already created here. It came from an Excel worksheet. There are more efficient ways of setting it up in Power Query or even in Power Pivot. Trying to skim some time off this video though. Here we're just going to mark it so that it knows to use this one source and not create these date tables for use when needed. What column are we using? Is it date? It is. Click OK. That's now been marked as the table to be used. Now let's come back to the Home tab, switch to Diagram View and establish those relationships. Now we can drag these tables around and order them however you like. Typically you have the transactional one in the middle and the others going around it, or it at the bottom and the others going along the top. And there are advantages and stuff to this. I've ordered and resized them this way, and to create relationships we're now going to drag between the fields. You're always encouraged to drag from the fact table, the transactional table, to the lookup tables. So to begin with, if I drag the date field from data to the date field in calendar, that would establish that relationship. So if this is a VLOOKUP, that's the lookup value to the first column of the table array. Same idea, and it will create this 1 to infinity icon, or this many to one relationship. You always drag from the many to the one. It's the most efficient way of working. We then drag from course to establish that relationship, and then from venue to establish that relationship. As you hover over each line indicating a relationship, it highlights in green the fields that are being used, which is very nice, just to check that it has understood you and you've dragged them correctly. And their relationships have been set up. If I did click on the Design tab at the top and then Manage Relationships button, We can also create these in this way. It's also nice that you can see a list of all the relationships as opposed to just looking at the diagram. And you can see the cardinality mentioned as many to one there, and where the filter direction and what tables are involved, table 1 and table 2. So lots of interesting information that we're not necessarily going to dive into too much in this video, but I wanted you to see that manage window. Okay, relationships are done. Next step is to start creating some DAX calculations, which we can then start to use in our pivot tables or anything else we may want to use with the power of Excel. So what is DAX and why is it so useful? Well, DAX stands for Data Analysis Expressions, and it is the formula language behind Power Pivot. It is extremely rich. There are a lot of DAX calculations, and it is evolving quite fast as a language and can take a little bit of time sometimes at the beginning for Excel users to become accustomed to it. Now, one of the things with DAX is that the calculations can be reused. A calculation is known as a measure. You can create calculated columns, but you can create these measures, which is really where you want to be focusing. And in this video, we are just going to look at creating measures. We're not going to do any calculated columns. But a measure can be reused, but only calculated once. Calculations in pivot tables or in Excel normally, you have a formula in every single cell of that column. Or in a pivot table, you're doing the same calculation like a sum in multiple pivot tables. Now, there are also a lot more DAX calculations. As I say, it's a very rich language. And if you focus on pivot tables, they can only do 11. Sum, average, standard deviation, and 8 more. Now, yes, you can create calculated fields, but that's never been that great. Measures can be formatted in advance. When you're using pivot tables, you have to apply that formatting. Or when you write a formula in a cell, you have to format that cell, every cell. A measure can be formatted at the time of creation. And every time you use it, it will be formatted that way. You don't need to tell it, it knows in advance. And these measures can also be referenced in other measures. So imagine when you do a sum if in Excel and you have to tell it what column you want to sum. Or if you've got a measure that sums things, you can reuse that measure in other calculated measures like a sum if equivalent, as it would be. So these are some of the advantages which make DAX so useful and so interesting for Excel or Power BI people to pursue. So we are going to write 5 different DAX formulas. And although we'll be keeping it simple, these have been chosen because I think they're good examples of some of the potential and the advantages that DAX provides for us. So I'm going to click on the button to bring myself back to the workbook. And from the Power Pivot tab, we're going to create our first measure. We're going to click on the Measures button and select New Measure. And this is your New Measure window. It begins with the table that's going to store the measure, and I'm going to leave that as data. I'm going to put all of them in that transactions table. The measure name for the first one is going to be total attendees, where we're simply going to sum the attendees column from the data table. I won't worry about a description, but then we'll type the formula. Now in this formula box, you can hold down your control button on the keyboard and scroll with your mouse wheel as a nice way of zooming in and just making the size larger there for when you write. And if I type sum, so just like the sum function from Excel, you get a sum, a DAX function as well. And if I press tab to bring that along, it prompts me for the column name to sum. And nice and simply, that is going to be the data table attendees column. So if I double click on that, data attendees. Now for those of you who may have written Excel formulas on data that's in the table, this will look pretty much the same, really, to how you may have done it before. Some of the other measures we create will look a little bit different. But if you've got experience in the area, that is good for you when you're beginning with DAX. I'll close the bracket and press my button to check formula. It says there's no errors. That sounds good. I'll come and say that the formatting will be a number. It is a whole number. You can't have 2.3 people. It's either 2 or 3. And I will need a 1000 separator. We've had quite a few attendees. And this is the advantage, as I was saying, about formatting the value up front. I won't have to tell it again, but I can use this calculation, this simple sum, in multiple pivot tables, but it'll only calculate it once. It won't calculate it 3 different times because it's in 3 different pivots. I won't have to format it 3 different times. It is faster and more efficient. I'll click OK, and that measure is created. If I scroll down on this right hand side in the field list, I can see it there with the little FX icon. And let's go and create the second measure. Measures button, new measure. This is also in the data table, and this one is total courses, where we will write a formula that will find out how many courses in total that we have run. Now this one's going to be a count. I'm not summing the attendees column, I'm counting it to see how many there are. And for this function, as I type count, I'm going for count rows. Notice some of the functions you might recognize, like count and count A and count blank. But then there are others, like count rows, count X, distinct count, which you do not get in Excel. So immediately you're seeing how rich the DAX language is. Count rows, and it prompts me for a table. The sum prompts me for a column. This one prompts me for a table. And the table is going to be data. That's where the transactions are. No point in me counting the courses table. That just tells me how many different courses we offer. How many did we run? That's the data table. Close off the bracket, check the formula. Looks good. Number, whole number, 1000 separator, OK. Second measure is created. Now these are being added onto the worksheet as well here. I can see I've actually got a pivot table because I did have a blank pivot table before I started creating these measures. And because it was active, they've started to add these into the pivot table straight away. Now I'm going to click on a cell on the worksheet to come out of that pivot table at this point. But nice that we can see 15,465 attendees, 3,214 total courses. It's always nice if you can check your DAX regularly, just to see that it's working. You may have an idea, or you may know for sure what the answer is to this question. And we can check how DAX works before we start using it in different formulas and visualizations, etc. Now it's time for another measure, new measure, measure number 3, data table. This one is going to be called attendees previous year. So I want to write a measure that will calculate how many attendees we received in the previous year to whatever the current year is. And that current year will be specified via a slicer or the row labels of a pivot table or something like this. Now for the formula, a couple of good ones here, which is part of the reason I'm picking on these for my demonstration. We're going to start with the most important function of all in DAX, which is a function called calculate, which can add or remove filters to an expression. It's extremely useful and important to know. We're not going to talk about it much now. That will be far more in depth than what this video can offer. But it prompts for an expression. And one of the reasons I want to use this is to demonstrate that we can reuse a measure. I'm going to bring the total attendees measure into this measure. And that's another advantage of using them. The fact that I can reuse a measure, not only in multiple pivot tables, but also in other measures. I can use it again and again and again, and it's only calculated once. Total attendees, comma, prompts for a filter. Now, another function's coming in here, we're going to use a function called date add. And here it is. If I double click on this, this returns a table specified by expressions, and it allows us to shoot a number of intervals in the past or also in the future. Now, the first thing it asks for is where the dates are. They're in the calendar table, date field, comma, number of intervals -1, one previous to the current one, comma, what is the interval? It's a year. We do have the option of using intervals such as month and others. Close bracket for date add, close bracket for calculate, check the formula, and then we specify numbers. Once again, it's just another whole number with a 1000 separator. And there's measure number 3. It's not been added to a pivot table because I clicked outside of it, but it is added to the data table. Okay, next couple of measures. This one is going to be called attendees diff prev year. The difference to the previous year. So we created that previous measure which found out how many attendees in a previous year. And we can use that in pivot tables, etc. But I'm creating that with the idea that now I can create comparisons in other measures. So all I'm going to do here is do the total attendees. I'm going to use that measure and subtract that previous measure, the attendees previous year. What's the difference between how many and how many in the previous year? Check the formula. And here we go with whole number. Use a 1000 separator. Click OK. That pivot table is selected, so it's been added to it. Now what I'm going to do, let's just remove some of these from that pivot table and let's check how some of these are working so far. So if I was to drag the course field into rows, there's all our courses like we saw earlier in the video. But then maybe I'm going to drag in total attendees into values. And there's the total for all of our courses, much better than how we saw it earlier in the video. It now clearly works. We've got a total at the bottom, 15,465. You may even remember that number from earlier. But now we've got that filter context being applied in the pivot table. How many for the dashboard course? How many for VBA? How many for Excel level 1? And we can now see that. Now, if I was going to bring in attendees for the previous year and drag that in here and then change course into year, where's year from our calendar table. Now this is nice because we can check how things are working before we start using it in other examples where it may not be clear whether it's working or not. So here we can clearly see that the total attendees 2016 was 2,906. And then our previous year, when it moves into 2017, is bringing back the same number. So I know that that measure is working before I start using it in other examples where I may not be able to tell just looking at the number whether it's right or not. But although this is not necessarily an amazing report right now, it is double checking my DAX before I take it much further. And talking about much further, let's click outside of that pivot table and create our final measure. And we found the difference. This time I want to know percentage difference. So attendees, percentage diff, prev year is what I'm calling it. And the formula is going to use a function called divide. Once again, this is a DAX function that you do not get in Excel or in your pivot tables. It's known as your safe divide because I can use this division to create that percentage. But whereas Excel sometimes produce a div/0 error, this gives us an alternate response to that. So I'm doing the attendees difference previous year by attendees prev year. They are my numerator denominator, comma 0 as an alternate response to avoid the error. Close the bracket, and for something different this time as well, it's a number again, but the format will be a percentage. I don't want any decimals and I don't need a 1000 separator. I'm clicking OK. That measure is added as our fifth and final measure for this video, to the data table on the right hand side. So we can now start to see that in action, which we've seen a little bit already, but just that little bit further in some pivot tables on our worksheet. So I just wanted to create a few more pivot tables to fully demonstrate the reusing and the formatting behind our DAX measures. So I've still got this pivot table on screen at the moment, and I just want to do a couple of quick things to this. I'm going to right mouse click on the pivot and come into the options. And I want to turn off the auto fitting of column widths. That can be really frustrating when we bring the slicer in the moment and how it will adjust the widths automatically. The next thing I want to do is change the pivot table's name. So I'll come up to the Analyze tab and I'll give it a decent name, such as Attendees by Year. And I think in this pivot table, I can now remove the Attendees Previous Year measure and bring in something a little bit more useful, such as the difference to the previous year. So that now we can see that there are 842 more attendees 2017 compared to 2016, 39418 compared to 2017. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, don't expect an amazing dashboard in the few minutes I'm going to dedicate to this. It's just some quick examples of our measures in action and the relationship between our multiple tables. Let me just resize that column. Okay, so there's one. Let's take a copy of that pivot. Let's have another one about here, and we'll give it a decent name. This one is going to be about courses, so attendees by course. And for this one, I'm going to remove the year, bring in the course from the courses table. And you can see I've got the two measures from the data table running. So I've got information from a calendar table in the first pivot table with the two measures running. I'm now getting information from the courses table with the two measures running. So we can see how strong those two relationships are. Now with this second one, I may decide to bring in the percentage difference, and notice how the formatting is already applied to it. We mentioned how the formatting in the pivot table, the format of the measure was applied when it was created. So whenever I drag it into a measure, and we can see measures being reused here as well in more than one pivot table, the formatting's taken care of, and we can reuse the same calculation, although it's only applied once. Now I wanted to bring in one more pivot table, so I'm going to copy that one. I'm going to bring in another one. This is also going to have the course, but it's going to be the number of courses run. It's the number of courses by course. Some quick naming here. Please don't judge me too much on the naming. I'm going to get rid of total attendees and these two differences and just bring in the measure we used when we did the count rows. So now I can see how many of each of those courses we ran over the whole of these 4 years. Now I want to go back to one of our pivot tables here. So I'm going to come to the first pivot table and I'm going to bring in a slicer quickly. And this is going to have the venue. Now I can't see the venue in the list of tables at the moment. I see calendar, I see courses, I see data. Where's the venue? And when you look to the top, there is an All tab. At the moment, it's only showing the active tables. All three of those have been used amongst our 3 pivot tables. If I choose All, now I see venue. I can bring in the venue field, click OK, and I've got a slicer. Let me quickly format it differently. And if I use that, it's currently filtering that first pivot table, but I can come up to report options and I can hook it into the others. And now you can see the name of the pivot table is quite handy. And I'm going to bring this in for all of them. But then let's go and create another slicer. Now for this one, I don't want the next slicer interacting with the years. going to keep that separate. I'm going to select the second pivot table. Bring in a slicer, and that's because this one is going to be about the year. So I don't want it reacting, let's make this green. I don't want it reacting with the year's pivot. Let's make it work with attendees by course, number of courses by course. So if I choose 2017, I can see that we ran 6 Excel formulas and functions courses, only 2 best practice and tips courses, and 2 BI introduction courses. In 2018, I can now see the data for that, etc. And this second slicer is just focusing on the last 2 pivot tables. The first was controlling all 3. And although this is a crude example knocked up in just a few minutes to showcase all 4 tables in our model working together, whether they be in a pivot table through measures or through slicers. And we can see the relationship between them and the filter context being applied by the years and the courses in our pivot tables. So hopefully this has been a useful demonstration of how you can use Power Pivot to bring data in, although we technically use Power Query to do that, model it, and then produce some analysis in the back end. I hope you found this video useful. Please check out some of our others on our YouTube channel and come check us out at Computergaga.com.